July 6, 2024. Well, last few videos have been focused on things like the presidential debates and the Supreme Court decision, but I want to get back to developments that are now underway in the Ukraine war and also the upcoming NATO summit. Because essentially, a lot's been happening there. I think that first of all, we might want to mention that, of course, the Russians have put forward their demands for a ceasefire and a peace plan, so to speak, which I would regard as being very unlikely to be accepted. Let's put it that way. But on the other hand, one might consider them to be just an initial negotiating position. After all, if you put out your best offer first, I mean, you're going to get pushed back further from that. So that, this is one of those kind of a feeler things, maybe. And then, of course, we're having the NATO summit coming up, which, of course, will be another test for President Biden to see what his cognitive effectiveness is here. Because he's obviously now stated he's not quitting, and so we'll see how that goes. But I've already addressed that in a video 2 times ago. So, what we really are looking at here is this, how he performs at the NATO summit and what decisions are made. So we've got the Russian plan out there. Then I guess Orban of Hungary has met with Zelensky of Ukraine, and then went to Moscow to meet with Putin. And so far, I think that if this is a peace negotiation, there's no real progress made. However, it is a communication channel that both can talk to. So in that sense, it's probably a positive development. And so we kind of get into, how things are going in the war. One thing I'd point out is that, I've been looking into the issue of just how many ATACMS missiles we have, and how, I don't know how many have been provided. I think it's a relatively small quantity. There are something on the order of, I believe, 1,100, at least before they start using them, of the cluster munition types that we've been seeing show up in the Ukraine war. But there's also unitary warhead variants as well. I think the total U.S. inventory going into this conflict here is about 3,000, I believe. And it is out of production at the moment, all those plans for future production, which will take some time to implement, obviously, given the way contracting works. So, at any rate, so there is a real question of just how many of these missiles we've actually provided Ukraine and how many we're planning to eventually provide, which will have some impact on their effectiveness. The early deployments obviously caught the Russians by surprise and were relatively effective against targets being hit. Including air defense systems. As of late, there have been several instances where the Russians apparently have been able to intercept these missiles, and it may very well be a question that the systems were simply not, if you will, tuned for. I mean, they were looking at the incoming, ideas of aircraft, drones, and basically, and low-flying missiles like the Storm Shadow. Whereas, these ATACMS are ballistic missiles and come in from high altitudes. And so there may be a question of just configuration and orientation of how you set up your system to be able to intercept those. And of course, the incidents that occurred on the beach in Crimea, which was basically due to a shoot down of apparently 5 missiles were hit by the air defense. And one of them, I guess, got close enough that the canister containing the bomb was broken open, and the bomb came flying down over the beach. So, but apparently this has led to some harsh diplomatic exchanges between the U.S. and the Russians, and that led to our defense secretary calling his Russian counterpart. From what I can tell, that there was some threats to shoot down the drones we were using to help the Ukrainians target forces and concentrations in Crimea. And as far as I can tell, I don't believe any have actually been shot down, but it seems like at the moment maybe they're keeping them away from the coastline, keeping them further back. Can't confirm that, but at least on the sources I've seen, it seems to be showing them that way now. So anyway, if you like these videos, please give me a like. Always looking for more subscriptions. Thanks to the one that apparently recently just subscribed, and also I do post these on Rumble as well, so you can subscribe either place if you're interested. So it looks like maybe there's a little bit of a pullback there. Although the other issue, of course, is how the war is going itself. I would say that since my last update, the Russians are continuing to take territory, village after village, so to speak. Tree line by tree line. It's an ongoing infantry battle. It looks like that the days of the swift-moving armored column seems to be over with, and we're back to true infantry combat in its most nasty sense. Trench warfare, drones to attack the infantry, drones to supply the infantry with water and anything else they might need, maybe even ammunition. It's a rather gruesome thing, but the Russians are moving ahead and taking territory. And of course, they're far from taking the territory they're demanding for their peace negotiation purposes that they put forward. It doesn't look like anybody on the U.S. and NATO side are prepared for peace negotiations at all at this point. The NATO summit, we'll see what that leads to, probably further commitments to Ukraine, I presume, and maybe more weapon packages to be provided. So that's kind of the way it's developing at the moment. One of the interesting things, of course, has been the incursion north of Kursk, Kharkiv, and for a while there, the Ukrainians were focusing on a counterattack, which looked like it was making some progress. But as of late, it looks like the Russians have kind of recovered, and even though they have less forces there, they seem to be slowly inching forward again. And it looks like that because of the use of air power by the Russians, including their various so-called FAB bombs, glide bombs, they've been able to inflict a fair amount of casualties on the Ukrainian counterattackers, who are largely supplied apparently with a mixture of elite troops and new conscripts that are barely trained. It's kind of a mixture of that, apparently. Ukraine has claimed they've raised 14 new brigades, although it's unclear, I guess these are, again, mostly, people have been pressed into service recently during the big conscription drives. So we'll have to see how effective they are. There's a lot of propaganda, going on both sides, claims that these people, aren't that dedicated to the fight by the Russian advocates, and I suppose, and it may well be true considering how they ended up in the service, many of them. But anyhow, that's kind of the scope of it at the moment. There's some interesting activities on the Belarus border. And there's certainly a concentration of both Ukraine troops on one side and Belarus troops on the other side. It could well be that Ukraine fears that Russia will try another attack toward Kyiv through Belarus, like they did at the beginning of the war, and therefore they're developing, minefields and defensive positions. It looks like that to some degree Belarus is throwing out ideas along the lines that maybe they're planning on attacking in Belarus. I doubt that's really going to happen. We'll see. Skirmishes are possible, but I also doubt that in some ways that Russia is going to attack through Belarus either, at least not until they're, let's say, near the end game of the war. I don't think they're going to do it early because, for one thing, Russia's taken some losses by drone attacks on refineries. As I understand it, Russia's using the Belarus refineries to compensate to some degree for those setbacks. So I doubt they really would want to, at this stage, to do anything of that sort. However, there are apparently fairly large numbers of Russian troops that have yet to be committed that are moving somewhere in what they call the group of forces north. So we'll have to see where they use them. There is a small incursion near Sunni, I believe, but it hasn't gone very deep, and it's pretty small. So that's maybe just an attempt again to sort of create another feint and divert a certain number of Ukrainian forces that could otherwise be fighting in the east and the Donbass and Luhansk fronts. And instead, they would be, just waiting around for an attack that probably won't really develop, maybe. And that seems to be part of the Russian strategy there. I think one of the problems we're going to have also on negotiations is fundamentally, I think at this point, we often talked about how that we don't trust the Russians. I think it's also developed the Russians don't trust us either. And that has to do with a lot of the machinations that have occurred before the war broke out, including the so-called Minsk Accords, which the former chancellor of Germany admitted was simply an attempt to buy time, and they were never sincere about the promises made there. So that doesn't help any. And remember that Ukraine was close to making a fairly attractive deal to end the conflict, at least from the point of view of where they are right now. And they turned it down and went for this full-scale conflict that they've been in. So the other thing, it's interesting, we're now awaiting the presumably imminent deployment of F-16s that have been long promised. And of course, it's up in the air that recently a set of Russian missile attacks have successfully destroyed perhaps up to several Ukrainian aircraft, both Su-27, which will be their attack aircraft that carries the Storm Shadow, or perhaps JDAM bombs, and some helicopters. I think total 10 aircraft in all might have been destroyed or damaged in these missile attacks, as well as attacks on fuel reserves that might be used for the aircraft. So it looks like the Russians are able to attack airfields where the F-16s might be deployed from, which leads to some question as to how they're going to be deployed. The pilots are one thing, but what about the ground support crews? Who are those? Are these contractors that we've arranged to go there, or will they be supported in NATO bases in Poland and perhaps Romania, and then basically fly forward to a base in Ukraine to refuel and perhaps arm there, or just to refuel, whichever, and then to take off from those forward bases to attack, and then ultimately fly back to the NATO, a safe zone to operate from. In other words, the actual attacks won't directly come out of that, but they will be the more, let's say, the logistics and the maintenance of the aircraft will be conducted back there. On the other hand, if Russian drones can spot these planes when they're refueling and perhaps arming in Ukrainian territory as they fly forward, they can become vulnerable to attack on the ground. And of course, in the air, they can become vulnerable to surface-to-air missile systems or Russian fighter aircraft, which have some pretty long-range missiles. Again, we don't know what we know AMRAAMs are being provided to the Ukrainians. I'm not sure what version. I mean, they probably have maybe the earlier versions, A and B versions. I don't think the D version has been provided yet. I don't believe, but maybe. That will give them a longer range capability if they have it. But at any rate, so that's the kind of thing that's afoot here. We'll just have one theory is, would this lead to the Russians taking some sort of attempt to go after these planes in the NATO territory, leading to a major escalation of the conflict? Probably won't do that, although there's also the possibility that it wouldn't be an overt attack, but some attempt at maybe sabotage. That might, because there's been, there's a warning out that if you've heard about it, that there's risk of a terrorist attacks on NATO bases, perhaps associated with the NATO summit on the 9th and through 11th of the coming week here. And that could also, who are these terrorists and who's paying for them? Or are they really, truly jihadis? That we're not clear about. And that could be another factor that's sort of pending out here. So at any rate, that's kind of a rundown of what I see happening. Continuous, successful Russian advances on the ground. It's slow moving. It's certainly not a blitzkrieg, but they are point by point breaking through Ukrainian defense lines and moving on to the next one. Um, and the ATACMs, even if provided, there is some demand that they shoot deeper into Russian territory and hit air bases. But it seems like the Russians might end up just basically moving some of their planes back further. One of the interesting things is that neither Russia nor Ukraine has really developed fairly good protective shelters for their aircraft on the ground, which seems kind of strange. One of the few YouTube sites I follow, a guy named Weeb Union, interesting name. He was criticizing that the other day, and I thought that's kind of interesting. I've been kind of wondering about that myself. Is given the cost of a tactical aircraft that's lost, you could build several protective shelters that certainly protect against cluster munitions, and would probably, require a direct precision strike by a unitary warhead to destroy a single target, which would definitely reduce the missile effectiveness. But neither side has really done this in any quantity yet. Of course, support facilities would still be quite targetable. Anyway, so that's kind of where we are right now. We'll be looking forward to see what comes out of the NATO summit, how President Biden performs at the summit, and any other developments. So at any rate, this will be. I'll wrap this up for now, and we'll, of course, as always, post this on YouTube and Rumble, and the address of my social media accounts are in the description below.